tells us that we are looking toward an end in sight. What we want to do is realize some particular end state. Utilitarianism calls for the maximization of goodness in society as being that end state. And it asks for the greatest amount of good for the greatest number of people involved. And therein lies a bit of a problem for utilitarians. And that is, how many people are we talking about when we talk about a specific number? Are these people a community of individuals locally? Are they a nation? Are they an entire world? It's very difficult to try to take into consideration everybody's best interest, or the greatest amount for the greatest number, greatest amount of good for the greatest number you can possibly conceive of. So that will become a bit of an issue for a thoroughgoing utilitarian. Now, we've discussed briefly already deontology. That comes from the Greek word deon, meaning duty, and logos, meaning the study of, really, or logic. And what we're talking about is that we look at, as we mentioned previously, actions, the kind of act that a person engages in, the value of that act. For a teleological theory, which comes from the Greek word meaning goal, or end, or goal-directed, the notion that there's value associated with a moral action has to do with the outcome of that act, or the consequences. So what a teleological theory does is concentrate on the consequences, and what utilitarianism does is try to maximize the greatest good for the greatest number in terms of those consequences. There are a couple of famous utilitarians. First and foremost would be Mr. Jeremy Bentham, and he of course invented a theory for measuring pain and pleasure that involved things like the hedons and dolors, dolors for pain, hedons for pleasure, and called it the hedonic calculus. So if you can imagine somebody who's trying to set and calculate the amount of good and bad in a mathematical way, that was Jeremy Bentham. According to him, you should maximize pleasure, minimize suffering. So any act that is engaged in ought to be one in which there's maximization of pleasure and minimization of suffering. John Stuart Mill was probably a somewhat even more famous utilitarian, a student of Bentham. Mill wanted to distinguish happiness from mere pleasure, and felt that there were several different orders of happiness, such as that which you get from intellectual undertakings, as opposed to just simply visceral or bodily ones, or satisfactions that one gets. Let's say the pleasure of reading a good book, possibly in the privacy of your study, your home office, your den, or perhaps looking at your iPod and reading something there, or maybe off of a Kindle. Doesn't have to be reading, but sometimes we don't associate these things with the kind of pleasure that we typically think of when people are talking about pleasure seeking, if they do, or at least if they don't talk about it, they're engaged in pleasure seeking through, let us say, drinking and other kinds of activities. So while there are indeed pleasures associated with more bodily, corporeal, and visceral kinds of activities, Mill thought that there were other forms of pleasure that could be sought in more intellectual terms. And of course, these higher pleasures are, if you will, more refined and superior to the lower pleasures. There are two types of utilitarianism. One is act utilitarianism, and what it states is that an act is right if and only if, and that's a very strong logical assertion, if it results in as much good as any available. Rule utilitarianism states that an act is right if it conforms to a certain rule. So you kind of have two different things going on here at different hierarchical stages. Act utilitarianism focuses on a specific act, and it turns out that whatever act that is, if in the long run the consequences are such that as much good as any available could be done, and a maximization of it, then it's a good thing. With rule utilitarianism, you actually have a kind of an umbrella concept that covers, let's say, several different act instances. You might say that an act type or category has within it specific actions, if I may use this language, that can, generally speaking, be called right actions because they conform to a rule. That's not just simply the specific act, but it's an act in conformance with a rule. that is associated with the systems of rules in which greater utility, meaning that the greatest good for the greatest number, results. So if a policy, for example, is adopted which fits under rule utilitarianism, it would mean that something like the following: we shall act in this way because, as a rule, this type of an act actually results in greater utility. Read, greater maximization of happiness for the community or the society which is involved. When we talk about any of these series, as you probably have noted so far, we have to talk about their strengths and their weaknesses. Utilitarianism has a strength because, in a sense, it does suggest an answer for every single situation. You could call that a strength. There's no particular ambiguity about the notion of utilitarianism itself. Perhaps it might be a little bit difficult to translate into actual practice, but it can be called an absolute objective system. It is basically a theory that has many different manifestations. There's not just one utilitarianism, but generally speaking, it provides at least the framework for theories that fit under utilitarianism, the utilitarianism umbrella, and thus gives us a certain kind of, I suppose, satisfaction at thinking that we've actually come up with a rule or a set of rules by means of which to behave morally. Seems to get at what we call the substance of morality, because what it really does is promote human good and tries to alleviate pain. So whether you're enact or rule utilitarianism, the utilitarian, what you primarily are going to be doing as such is promoting human good, or what are considered to be goods, both moral and non-moral, and also trying to reduce pain. Many people find that utilitarianism makes common sense, and I'm sure that you probably can see, if you think about it a little bit, that in your own life, you either yourself or have observed it in others, this kind of behavior, are utilitarian. Certainly it's very normal to consider what is in the best interest of your family when you're, let's say, deciding on what you're going to buy for the household, or whether or not you're going to consider getting that nice new watch or that good perfume for yourself. You're probably thinking, at least in part, that it's going to maximize your sense of happiness, however you define that. To some extent, that's at least consequentialistic, and it could be utilitarian if you are kind of calculating the amount of good over not good or evil that is going to occur, you think, as a consequence of your action. Some weaknesses. Kind of difficult to know how to quantify the term greatest. What is the greatest number of people? What is the greatest amount of happiness? How is it that we can possibly define those terms? Isn't it really true that you're only going to be affecting, in a long run, reasonably, the numbers of people that you have immediate influence over or are influenced by, and that usually, I think, is a restricted domain? But maybe not. If the President of the United States were a utilitarian, and perhaps some presidents have been more so than others, they're probably thinking, well, I want the greatest good for the greatest number, and the greatest good, in my view, affects the numbers of people in, let's say, the United States. So think about how you're going to try to factor in every single culture, every single individual, every single, the two genders, main genders, everybody who has an interest. Very difficult. What about those who are not in the greatest amount? How about the minority folks, so to speak, that are marginalized and on the periphery of society? Should we not take them into consideration too? And unfortunately, utilitarianism may, at least in one of its manifestations, have the untoward result that people who are typically marginalized don't get included in the calculus or the equation as to what the best thing to do is. And of course, if we talk about total happiness, we mean one thing. If we talk about general happiness, we mean another. So in other words, in every single dimension that you can rank yourself as happy, is that what you want in a good theory? Or do you want just sort of a 70% kind of thing? If we can make a person 70% happy given our action, then that would be a good act to engage in. What about knowing the consequences? Human beings, tend to have somewhat of a nearsighted view of the future. We really can't predict the future. We can take estimates, We can create probable scenarios, rather like predicting the weather, I would think, in some instances. Maybe we can do a mathematical kind of simulation and determine what the likely results are of our acts. But we really don't know. And we certainly don't know the long-term consequences. I mean, this is true if we fight wars. We think maybe on day one, for a year or two, some particular war or conflict that a country or society might be engaged in is a good thing, and then in the long run it may turn out not to be such a good thing. And trying to determine all of the consequences of a specific policy or course of action is extremely difficult to do, if not impossible. So if you are of the ilk of mind thinking that effects continue on down through the future, centuries and centuries from now, it's really quite true that you'll never know all the consequences. So, of course, to be reasonable and practical and give this serious due, probably never intended to take into consideration those consequences which a human being cannot really possibly know. But yet, calculating consequences for the next few years can be a very difficult, if not impossible, task. A couple of different ways of looking at consequences. You know, if C.S. Lewis, who is mentioned in your text, and that's the reason I mentioned him here, maintains, he says there are three: actual consequences, the things that actually do happen, the consequences that could reasonably have been expected to occur based upon your understanding of the universe, all things being equal, as we say, ceteris paribus, and how about the intended consequences, all of which can be different, by the way. Because typically in an act, if you've read your book, you'll know that there's a doctrine of unintended consequences. Almost for every action that people engage in, there's an unintended consequence. Sometimes it's severe, sometimes it's a relatively minor thing. But how about what really happens? And certainly if I have an expectation based upon my understanding and knowledge of the world that is a reasonable expectation about what may happen tomorrow, like a relative certainty that the sun is going to rise, the earth will rotate so that the sun rises, there will be a moon in the sky for a long period of time, we will not have the sea rising instantaneously 6 or 7 miles into the coast or over the coast. We have reasonable expectations about traffic and all sorts of things. So are we basing our decision upon that reasonable expectation? I think that probably in all instances C.S. Lewis is really talking about things that could be included in factoring how it is that we are going to arrive at valuing or the positive evaluation of a utilitarian act. What we call the no rest objection is that sort of funnily means that there are a variety of things that we can choose from. Which one is going to result in the best consequences? We could set every single moment of every day and try to ponder what act is going to result in the best possible consequences, but sooner or later we're actually going to have to act. What is the so-called absurd implication? It could be that there could be two acts of equal value, and one of them might be, from your point of view, actually in and of itself not a good thing to do. Like, let's say, sacrificing somebody for a worthy cause. The sacrifice itself might be an injustice under some ethical theory, and certainly by your own personal standards. But it could be actually an act which resulted in positive utilitarian value. Another act might, for example, be a little bit more palatable to you natively and result in the same or less value. So those are things that have to be considered. It could also be, which is a slightly related question, called the integrity objection. Maybe our most central and deeply held principles are violated when we actually engage in an act which can be calculated to produce, under reasonable conditions of expectation, calculated to produce the maximal effect that we want. Of course, people do things all the time that are, from a utilitarian point of view, I would argue, the quote-unquote right thing to do, and yet they violate their own personal code of conduct or ethics. I'll bet you find that happens in a workplace at times. I'll bet you find that can even happen in a marketplace, possibly with some of your colleagues, people that you associate with. The integrity objection actually has to do, or could have to do, with other kinds of moral dispositions that you have in addition to possibly being a utilitarian. What we call the justice objection. Some acts are useful, but still might be against what we call the justice system. So in other words, there might be a useful act from a utilitarian point of view that fits in perfectly with the idea that it's a good act from that point of view, and yet be against the law. There's a publicity objection. Moral principles have to be known, but utilitarians don't seem to be making the claim that everyone should act like a utilitarian. Interesting that we would have this kind of a problem. Now, maybe it's a tacit sort of suggestion that comes up. Should everybody be a utilitarian? What would happen if we asked John Stuart Mill that question? Might it be counterproductive to the main utilitarian thinker that everybody else is a utilitarian? So that could result in a kind of a paradox of sorts, could it not? So it might be better for some utilitarians not to reveal or divulge the fact that they're utilitarians. That's at least one aspect of this objection. One thing, however, seems to be true, that utilitarianism with respect to our posterity, future generations, seems to have more of an interest in promoting the good of future generations. And the idea that our obligation to future generations would be similar to the obligation to current generations. We'd want to also maximize, if possible, the expected utility for them as well. Create a greater amount of good over evil. So utilitarianism can provide us with a very strong moral idea about trying to provide for our children and our grandchildren. There's a conviction that may itself not be from utilitarian origins, but that humanity should go on and on and on. Now, some people, by the way, question that. There are many non-utilitarians who question the idea that humanity needs to go on. Some people think that just like every other species that pretty much has pre-existed us, sooner or later that they will come to an end. Why not humanity? But the utilitarian seems to believe that there's something really intrinsically, I suppose you would say, valuable about what a human being is, or humanity itself, and that it should go on, and that when we make a decision today, we should think of the people tomorrow that might come into existence. And of course, when we want to promote the idea of human happiness, we are talking often about utilitarianism, as well as what we talked about previously, and that was Greek ethics that promotes human flourishing and happiness too, perhaps in a slightly different way. But it is important to realize that human happiness will be what it is, given what a human being is, whether or not the humans involved exist. So future generations are important to utilitarians in their calculation about what an appropriate thing would be to do now, what appropriate behavior would be to engage in morally now. How does it affect future generations? You might have recalled that somewhere along the line you may have heard the story that the Iroquois Indians, Native American Indians, made decisions based upon the effects that their decisions today might have, I believe, the 7th or so generation down the line. Hard to predict what 7 generations of human descending from you or your tribe will be like, what world they will inherit. But think about it. If you acted that way, and let us say that you knew that certain toxins, the certain practices we have in emitting, let's say, toxic chemicals, in producing a lot of trash, a lot of rubbish, and causing degradation of the environment, you could probably calculate that fairly readily with vast numbers of people engaging in certain kinds of practices that we do know, whether there is such a thing as global warming or not, cause contamination of water and air. You might balance your behavior now with the idea in mind that future generations need to supposedly enjoy a sense of happiness too, and they would be deprived of that if today we behaved in a way that did not take into consideration their well-being. So see, that's a strong point for utilitarianism. So I hope that you consider it and the other moral series as you ponder how these series actually can apply to your daily life.